Okay, we're going to talk about in this area obligations and performance of a sales contract under Article 2. We're going to look at what are the general principles and obligations for performance with the buyer and the seller. What are the duties of the parties in performance of the contract? What are their duties? What are their obligations? In every sales contract, there is an implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. And so, what that means is that there's an obligation of good faith and timely performance. And good faith means honesty in fact and in conduct. So that if one of the parties acts in such a way that there is not this good faith, or there's not this honest dealing, the other party can bring a breach of this implied covenant of good faith, a claim for that. There are certain obligations for performance in a sales contract, and when you're dealing with a cash sale without delivery or non-shipment, performance should occur between the buyer and the seller at the same time, or concurrent performance is expected. Repudiation is a breach. If you have an ordinary repudiation, that means that the breach of the contract or the repudiation occurred at the time that performance was supposed to occur. So, for example, if I was a seller and I was supposed to deliver the goods that are part of the contract on today, and I did not deliver on today, then I have repudiated or breached the contract. And so, under the circumstances, that would be an ordinary breach. If you have a breach that comes before the time for performance, let's say the time for performance was supposed to be July 1, and before that July 1 date, maybe June 29th, the seller makes it clear that he, she, or it is not going to perform. That would actually be a anticipatory breach. It happens before the time for performance because it was before the July 1 date of performance. With an anticipatory breach or repudiation, the non-breaching party can consider the contract canceled. They can wait until the time for performance, or they can sue immediately. If either party to a contract feels insecure about the other party's performance and they have reasonable grounds to feel this way, that party can demand in writing adequate assurance of performance. And so, once that demand for adequate assurance of performance has been stated, if adequate assurance is not given within 30 days, the demanding party may treat the contract as being repudiated or being breached. And what constitutes meeting that demand for adequate assurance is determined by the party who has these reasonable grounds to believe that the other party is not going to perform. Duties of the parties. The seller has a duty to deliver the contracts according to how, or deliver the goods according to the contract. So I should say that deals with our perfect tender rule. So the duty of the seller is that the seller will give conforming goods. The time, place, and manner of delivery are usually a part of the contract. If not, then you would use the UCC terms. The seller, if nothing is stated in the contract, the UCC says that the seller's place of business is going to be the place of delivery, because remember, unless stated otherwise, the contract is a non-shipment contract. There's no requirement for the seller to deliver the goods, so the buyer would have to come to the seller's place of business. If the seller doesn't have a place of business, then it's the seller's resident. If the time for shipment or delivery is not stated, if it is a shipment contract, it's a reasonable period of time. The buyer does have the right to insist on perfect goods Also, the buyer has the right to insist on one-time delivery of goods. So if some of the goods are not delivered at the same time, the buyer can refuse to accept. And if any of the goods are not um, conforming to the contract, the buyer can actually um, reject the goods because of the perfect tender rule. So the buyer, though, has to accept conforming goods. So the buyer, if their goods are perfect, has to accept the goods according to the contract. The buyer does have the right before accepting to inspect the goods. Has the right to um, again, like I said, inspect the goods. They have the right to open packages, remove the goods, conduct tests. The only exception is if it's cash on delivery. And if it's cash on delivery, that means that the buyer has to pay cash for it to be delivered. At that point, the buyer has no right to inspect until payment is made. But the payment when it's cash on delivery does not constitute acceptance in that case. The buyer has a right to reject when the goods are not conforming. The buyer can reject the full shipment. They can accept the commercial unit and reject the remainder. As long as after rejecting the goods, if the buyer is going to reject, the buyer should not exercise any ownership over the goods. So if you're going to reject, you can't then use the goods. Um, and rejection has to take place within a reasonable period of time, and notice has to be given to the seller of the rejection. The seller right to cure after the buyer's rejection. After a buyer rejects the non-conforming goods, the seller may have the right to cure the goods, or basically that means to make the goods or make a conforming delivery of the goods. Under the circumstances, the seller would have the right to cure if the contract time for delivery has not expired, and the right to cure notice is given, and it takes place, the actual cure takes place within the time of the contract. If the time of the contract has already expired, the right to cure can happen if the seller had reasonable belief that the non-conforming goods would be acceptable, and seasonable notice of the cure is given. The buyer's duty to accept the goods. The duty arises if the buyer has no grounds to reject the goods after inspection, or basically if you have perfect tender, perfect conformance, non-conforming goods, not non-conforming goods. Acceptance of the goods can be expressed or implied. So if you use the goods, assuming it's not by conduct, assuming it is by conduct, if you use the goods, that's enough. So if you're trying as the buyer to reject, you can't use the goods. That's a simple way of saying that. The buyer's revocation of acceptance. Now, a buyer can reject the goods even for minor defects because you're of the perfect tender rule. But what happens once the buyer has already accepted the goods? Can the buyer revoke the goods? Under the circumstances, the buyer may revoke the goods even after acceptance if the goods do not conform to the contract and the defect in the goods substantially impairs the value of the contract, and either the defect was not easily discoverable upon inspection, or the seller had promised to correct the problem which the buyer was aware of. So if you have the goods do not conform and there is a substantial impairment, and either the defect is not easily discoverable, or when it was discovered, the seller promised to correct. Buyer's revocation of acceptance. A buyer can revoke acceptance, but to revoke properly, the buyer must give the seller notice of revocation. A notice of revocation must be given within a reasonable period of time after the buyer discovers or should have discovered the defect. And after revocation, the buyer has to hold the goods and await instructions from the seller. The buyer has a duty to pay the contract amount for accepted goods. The time for payment will be based on the terms of the contract. If silent, the time of payment is at the time of the receipt of the goods by the buyer. And the form of payment is going to be cash unless otherwise stated in the contract.